Ethan Berkowitz, Mayor.
Mike Abbott, City Manager.
Robert Harris, CFO.
Patrick Flynn.
Elder Greg Johnson.
Dick Training.
Forrest Dunbar, patient 0.
John Wells. Pete Peterson, moved down.
And then audience, please introduce yourselves.
Suzanne Poultry from the Mayor's Office.
Lance Wilbur, Office of Management and Budget.
Mike Chadwick, Internal Audit.
Debbie Keller, Media.
And the gentleman in the back.
Meyer Hutchinson, Mayor's Office.
Bill Falsey, Municipal Attorney.
Thank you.
Shirley Nelson, Budget Advisory Commission.
Thank you very much. Okay, SAP Alden, there you go. You have the floor. Thank you.
Right. Actually, Madam Chair, if I could just launch
Please, Mr. Mayor.
again and then turn it over to Alden. We wanted to praise the Assembly of the condition of the SAP project. And I wanted to start by making some introductory remarks. We came into this project a little more than a year and a half ago. And when we began the project, approximately $40 million had already been spent. The initial expectation was the project would cost about $10 million. I think that, in retrospect, was a highly unrealistic expectation. And so the history of this project is important to remember in the context of it. And I want you to know that we have a high degree of confidence that we will finish this project during the summer. And the credit for that goes to the municipal employees that have worked tirelessly and persistently and rising to the call of duty in a way that brings credit to Anchorage. That's a really important thing for us to recognize. The success, the future success of this project is largely due to the people who work for the city. During the course of the last 18, 20 months, we have had to reevaluate the conditions that of SAP. We had a new relationship with project managers from their side, a new partnership, and we've been able to wrest significant concessions from them during the course of those negotiations. Order of magnitude approximately $10 million. That's a significant change. But I want to emphasize that when we look back and see where we were when we began the project, this is much more in the lines of a rebuild, not a remodel. And I say that because we had high expectations when we began that the $40 million that had been spent would yield benefit to us moving forward. That was essentially negligible, and we probably spent more trying to find value in that $40 million that we derived from it. And so moving ahead, our expectation on the project is that we will be able to complete within what would have been a realistic budget. And so those are my preliminary comments, and I'd like to turn them to all.
Thank you, Mr. Zern.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I always like to start with our kind of a landscape document. And I know it looks quite daunting, and I look at it every day, but this is really the scale of the SAP project. And I think it's really important for everybody to understand this is not a small thing. That's why it's taken a long time, and 6 years to be able to do this. I basically highlight this is that on the very left side there, we have a variety of people that need to get into the system or want to be able to use the system. That ranges from employees to vendors to all sorts of different entities that have access to this. So we want to make sure that we're always allowing a system that has maximum access. That middle group there is basically everything that we're doing. And we're doing many, many modules to be able to run this, both in the finance, the purchasing, the payroll, all of the HR functions that we have. In addition to this, I'll remind the Assembly that we are removing Kronos and installing a new time and attendance one. And then also, which I know was high on the Assembly's agenda, was an enterprise content management. So we're still on scale and target to do this. We have not, since we started this project, removed any scope from what was intended to begin with. In fact, we've actually are going to try to add a little bit more scope, and I'll get to that functionality and some additional reporting that we're looking at. But as you can see, this This system will impact the entire municipality, including the utilities, and it will also impact how other businesses and entities and employees interact with the municipality of Anchorage. And then the right-hand column there is that while this system is for, we have to be able to use that information for a variety of business decisions. So those are the outputs, which are all the different reports that we're going to be able to use and be able to answer questions brought to us by any member of the municipality of Anchorage in a variety of different formats. So this is kind of the layout, and this is what we're marching towards. But it is an extremely complex project with many different variables, approximately 100 consultants, and probably 20 to 30 really core municipal employees, as the mayor mentioned, who are dedicated their time to making this project a success. Nights, weekends, it's been a lot of work. So, but this is kind of the scale of what we're talking about. A real quick history. This started back in mid-2011 with Black and Beach at an estimate of just under $10 million in 18 months. That led to Black and Beach being removed just because the scale and the quantity of work and the dollar amounts were sorely understated at that point in time. Peloton came in 2013, tried to take over and get the system to turn live again. That did not work as well. The other key one here I want is that SAP came in to do an audit based by the Assembly in January of 2015, put together a large report of over 600 different issues with the system at that point in time that needed to be rectified. So we began blueprinting. The mayor and the administration team came in around June, July of 2015. I want to remind the Assembly we also then took a pause right away to try to evaluate where we were at. And we had that external review committee made up of business leaders and knowledgeable IT professionals throughout the municipality of Anchorage. They took the time and made a recommendation to the administration that we continue down the path with SAP, which we did. We began the blueprinting process back, which is really the design phase of the system. That completed in April 8th of last year. During that time period, we came forward and brought SAP on board as the prime. We talked about at that point in time that it was really beneficial to have SAP on board to do the project governance for the installation of their own system. We finished up the design build phase of the system late December, first part of January, and then we began into our testing phase. And we completed the first round of system integration testing at February 10th time period. So that's kind of a history of where we're at and how we got here. The last several weeks, what we've been working on is looking at anything that needed to be fixed that was discovered during that time period, as well as resolving a few additional objects that we were trying to develop.
Can you hold up for one moment, Mr. Trainer, for question, please?
And just as you're recanting this, you need to add to Black and Beach that the last administration settled that out of court, so we couldn't even go after Black and Beach for damages. In that way, they tried to start this program.
That is correct. So there was a settlement with Black and Beach as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's kind of the history of where this project has come from and where we are currently at. I presented this slide to you last time, just to that I was here a couple of weeks ago, just to give you an analysis of where we were as far as what the money had been spent. I think the highlights of this particular project is that the budget is $71,153,000. That was through a variety of different funding mechanisms throughout the entire 6-7 year time period that this project has been going. We have either expensed all of that, or that money has been encumbered to a substantial point, but we may not have had invoices for it. But as you can be looking at the spreadsheet, and I know there's a lot there. The top part is really all the consulting time. And then if you remember, there is a large chunk of municipal time as well that we had allocated to this project going forward. But the vast majority of the money has either been spent or invoiced and or is expected to be invoiced here relatively shortly. This is the current schedule that we were under with regards to the testing phase of this project. As I mentioned, we have completed the system integration test 1, and we are in the break fix portion of that. We've had a little bit of an issue with data, so we're currently evaluating that, and making sure that we're ready with the data that needs to go into our next testing phase. So we're currently evaluating that. The expectation is going to be we're probably a little bit over a week away to entering that. So we're targeting the 13th to enter the next cycle for SIT 2 testing. We'll evaluate any changes that might happen on the downstream schedules of that after we enter SIT 2 testing, and we can evaluate what our options are. We still do have some options hopefully in there to look at catching up this little bit of time that we've been delayed. As was mentioned by the mayor, we fully expect to be able to target this summer to be able to bring this system online as anticipated and expected. We also are very close to beginning the employee training. That's a critical component that we've talked about. This is a brand new system with quite a bit of change throughout the municipality and what their jobs are, as well as I mentioned, a lot of new functionality to the employees. So that big brown line there is really important because we've spent a lot of money on this system and a lot of effort. We want to make sure that the employees are trained and can take full advantage of the system day one to be able to use it going forward. So this is kind of a situation of where we're at right now. As the mayor mentioned early on, as we really dove into the blueprinting and the realization build phase of this project, it became readily apparent that a lot of the work that had been done in the past was not usable, and what all the estimates were based upon that SAP had gone, and we presented to you last year, were based approximately 40 to 50% of the we thought we could use of the prior system. That did not materialize. So as we've gone through this project over the last year and a half, a lot of additional labor work has gone into fixing, changing, editing, updating almost all the work that was done. As a result of that, this is solely a labor-driven thing. They're all hours. It's kind of a time and materials contract. Large number of gaps between what was contractually agreed to and what we actually needed to bring the system live started to materialize. And if you add up those bottom two numbers there, you can see it's approximately $10.8 million of gaps have occurred over the last year and a half. Through the mayor's dedication here to negotiations, you can see on the very bottom line, I'm going to start at the bottom there, and the partnership that we've established with SAP, they have, and in some parts, some of the estimates that they gave to begin with, they are investing in that $10.8 million gap approximately a little over $6.3 million. So that is their contribution to the gaps that have materialized over the last year and a half. The remaining $4.5 million here, I'll kind of go into a little bit of detail, but this is where we're looking for the municipality to make up that difference. Approximately $281,000, as I mentioned in a couple other meetings. This was after we finished the blueprint, we realized that there was a discrepancy in how that particular contract was put forward. This amount of money here will actually close that PO out, but we are short to finish the amount that we need to have for blueprinting. The next two items, the Peloton and the realization, that is the municipal responsibility to the gaps that have occurred over the last year and a half. That is being offset, like I mentioned, by the SAP $6.4 million there. There is an AMS contract that we're going to be talking about. I'll give a little bit more resource on that, but that basically is April, May, and June of additional capital that we need to spend to do a lot of the technical work associated with getting our production environment up and running. As I mentioned, a lot of municipal resources have been working on this project nights and weekends, so we've added an allocation for that with the community resources. We've been fiscally responsible and put a contingency amount in there. And then in addition to that, the current project manager who was hired to assist the mayor and the executive steering committee on this particular project, the amount of money that's in his contract will not get him through the go-live process. So we added an amount in there to be able to do that. So if you add up all those numbers, they total $4.5 million. That is what we're going to be bringing forth to you from a funding document, which will be on your agenda next on the 7th. I don't know, Mike, if you want to talk about that particular item.
Yeah, I'll hand it out to you as we're finishing up here today, or I can hand it out now. We're introducing on Tuesday night a request that we add $4.5 million to the master lease agreement, which is the device that we've been using to fund this project all along. So this would be new money for the project beyond the roughly $71 million that has already been approved for the project. So this would bring the project total to a little over $75 million. I'll hand it out to you. It'll be on the addendum for introduction on the 7th. Oh, thanks, Rose. And requesting a public hearing and action on March 21st.
So let me take this moment to underscore what I said earlier, which is this should have been a $35 to $45 million project from the beginning. And the fact that we had spent approximately $40 million that had no measurable benefit to the municipality is the reason why we are where we are. We had expectations that when we began reinvigorating the SAP process, that we would be able to negotiate hard with SAP and get at least some terms that were favorable to the municipality. We also had hopes that some of the work that had been done prior would be productive and constructive. That has not been the case, and as I said earlier, in some some line of logic, we spent a considerable effort and money checking to make sure if there were any value.
And unfortunately, some of those have led to schedule, takes longer to go through it, so it's impacted our schedule throughout the entire project as well. So what you're going to be seeing, which is kind of the layout of where the money would be going, is there will be the master lease authority, that document, as Mike mentioned, that will be going next week to public hearing on the 21st. In addition to that, there'll be 5 different consent agenda AMS memos, basically the Peloton. These are the areas where we need the money, spending authority to be able to go in and actually spend the funding to make up these individual contracts as you mentioned. The whole goal here, as the end, is what are we going to get from this? And this money here, as I mentioned, we're about ready to go into testing. We have several phases of testing. We have a cutover. We have all the training and so forth. So we have these different areas that we continue to progress through. We are in the process of actually installing the wiring for all the remaining clocks over at the utilities. That's on schedule. We're going to be actually installing 55 new clocks for the employees to use. And then in addition to that, this money will also complete the 3 departments, the ER, the accounts payable, and purchasing, electronic content management startup. That was very important, I know, to get started with OpenText. So this is basically the money to get us to the go-live time period to complete all of these different levels of responsibilities that the project's had, and as I mentioned, in those specific contracts that will be funding those. And pretty much all of those areas are consultant related. Those are time and material type contracts because people have done the work and done the labor to be able to accomplish this work and put us where we're at right now.
Thank you. Mr. Wellington.
A couple questions. One, we can't really say no or we have nothing. Is that right?
We need to finish the system. Yes.
Then consent. The SAP investment contribution. Why would they do that? Why don't they charge us? And what are they doing for $6 million?
Well, all of these, that 10.8 million is composed of actually 45 individual gaps, and a gap could be something where We anticipated that something was going to be completed in a certain area. For example, we thought that maybe assets was 95% done by the prior vendor, and then we went through the blueprinting only to find out that everything that assets had done was not usable. So we needed to get an assets consultant back in here, and that particular consultant has been working on the project since we started this realization and will need to be there all the way through. So that's labor. So that's, but we didn't anticipate the need for that. So when we use the word gap, we're saying what we thought the contract was, which we brought forward the assembly, and what we actually needed to be able to accomplish the work and bring the system live, we had a gap there. A couple of these items, one in particular is a scope thing that we're looking at. We're going to be adding 34 customized reports for the municipal employees through the blueprinting phase. It was determined that the outputs that SAP were offering just didn't meet some of our business needs and so forth. So I would call that an enhancement or a scope change, not necessarily something that we had anticipated going in. But the vast majority of these gaps are labor that needed to be done to fix, enhance the system as a whole, and all those different modules and so forth. There's where we needed more labor time, more consultant time, more development time, more testing time to be able to deliver a specific function, and then that is what leads when you add all those up to that $10.8 million number.
So, but why would SAP not charge us for that?
Because SAP's corporate reputation is on the line here. And we've been able to leverage their concern about corporate reputation, their corporate reputation in order to get these kind of concessions.
Because 11 of us are going to go on Yelp and say,
Well, you can get your friends to do it too. That's how a movement is born.
Well, and I think to be clear, we based the budget for the realization portion of the project that we brought you a year ago was based on SAP's estimates for how many hours of their time it would take to do things. So to the extent that a portion of this overage is associated with their not estimating it correctly, they have agreed that they bear some of the responsibility for that. And I think the majority of their contribution is in the areas where they either underestimated the time or they felt that their productivity, their team's productivity wasn't what it could have been. And so I think they, to their credit, came to this and understood that they needed to show some good faith. And the mayor was pretty directly involved in the conversations at the highest levels with SAP, and that led to I don't want to call it a straight contribution, but that led to them deciding not to bill us for those hours as they conceivably could in a time and materials contract.
Thanks.
I think we had what was being known as a frank exchange.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. For the record, I'd like to recognize that Mr. Dill joined us about 15 minutes ago. Mr. Dunbar.
Speaking of frank exchanges, would you say the chances are low, medium, or high that we pursue a lawsuit against either SAP or any of the other subcontractors after this process is done?
We're in the process of pursuing a project, and we are not contemplating anything at this juncture.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar.
And I will say this also, is that we are in this relationship with SAP, we are engaged in good faith, and we will continue to behave accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I just have a comment. With $6.3 million in concessions from SAP, I don't think it's a good idea to sue them with anybody. But anyway, Mr. Trainee?
Just getting back to what you're talking about, of course, that's, we've upset us from the last administration without our consent, sub-law court, Black and Beach. We can't go after them. They were the first implementer, and what they did, when we heard from all, and just didn't, they couldn't use it. It wasn't designed correctly. We'd love to have gone after the other administration settled that, we couldn't go after them now. So we reduced the pool. Relative to SAP, Melvin and I talked to San Diego that had a problem with SAP. Portland had a problem with SAP. a lot of other cities. Believe me, they do not need any more bad press of SAP starting and not succeeding. So I appreciate the administration working with the corporation on this for concession.
Thank you, Mr. Train. Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. It sounds like the conversations the administration has had very much mirror some of the conversations I had prior to their coming to office. My question is on the fund certification and how it gets paid. Mr. Harris, we're bringing an escrow. Does that mean the intent is that we will amortize this cost through debt service payments, or what's the? We just spent virtually all of our unencumbered fund balance, so I'm a little perplexed on how this works.
Certainly, through the chair, Mr. Flynn. So the master lease agreement that the Assembly had previously approved has a $50 million structure to it. This $4.5 million will come out of that existing $50 million structure. So after we're done with the project and we have moved out of the project phase, all the capitalization costs have been completed and we move to operation phase, then we will sit down and look at that note and make a decision financially whether it makes sense to how we'll proceed, what that term is, 7 years, 10 years, for converting that from this master tax lease into some other sort of financial arrangement. So if that sort of answers your question.
Not really. So what are the options on the table? Do we then perhaps issue a bond to repay the debt over the long term, or are we just going to make it part of our annual debt service payment? Help me understand that. Suzanne's shaking her head. I don't know what she's trying to tell me.
Thank you. Well, the master tax lease, we do have the ability to convert that into some longer-term financing structure. So from our perspective, we're going to try to find the means and method that ends up resulting in the lowest cost option for us. The kind of the questions that are out there now, we've been negotiating with KeyBank that's provided the master tax lease to us. We've had discussions with them about the term, 7 years, 10 years, perhaps a longer term. And then to pay that off, I think right now it's about $40 million that we've used out of the master tax lease. This would be in addition to that, I believe. And so we would take that total dollar number and spread that out over the payment period, and then that'll be paid for from our operating budget each year. Yeah, we would pay for that.
So I guess it would be helpful for me, Madam Chair, if I may, if Mr. Harris, you could draft a memorandum sort of talking about what the options are and what the structure of that looks like in terms of annual costs. And I presume that would come out of operating funds at the end of the day. And that's something that sort of needs to be factored in as we.
And in our 2017 budget, we've assumed that the project would go live on or around the middle of the year, and that we would start paying on the debt for SAP. Once it goes live, we're required to start paying for it. And so we have factored a half a year's worth of P&I on the existing note. Not to say that Robert and his team won't refinance it a different way, but that is in our 2017 operating budget right now for a half year.
I understand, and that's for a lower principal than we are now contemplating.
It'll be slightly higher as a result of that.
Well, slightly, I guess, a matter of magnitude, but yeah, 10% higher. So, okay, if you could take that request and revise Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. I just have a follow-up question. What's our interest rate on the master lease?
Forgive me, I don't have that number off the top of my head.
I think it's pretty
fairly
low.
low. Yeah.
Yeah, that was my point.
On some of the commercial paper we've been able to secure for short-term borrowing and so forth.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn and Mr. Harris. Mr. Steele.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Something that I learned in school was you don't consider sunk costs when deciding whether or not to proceed with something. You look at what you have. What you have is not going to be useful unless you spend additional funds when you make a decision on that basis. And, so as painful as it is, it seems to me we have to go forward to come out with a quality municipal product. If we don't do question, it seems to me it's a no-brainer in terms of whether to do it or not. The question is how you fund it. And I assume that you're telling us that the product will be valuable once we.
The project will be valuable when we're done. The project will be worthless if we don't complete it.
And if I may, it doesn't end the fact that PeopleSoft is on its last legs as well.
Yeah, I know,
We have,
that was justification for starting with the first one.
but we're that many more years down the road on a mainframe, and we need to have a system still to replace what we're currently using.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Steele?
have you run the idea or what we're hearing past our contract to see whether he thinks it's a good plan, that type of thing?
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Well, we're just today getting presentation,
Okay.
so no one has a contract.
That might be something.
But our contractor is going to be very aware of what happened today. And I thought he was going to be in line, but since he isn't, I know he's going to connect with Mr. Thurman to talk about this and make some comments at his next presentation next month.
Our plan was to make sure that Zig gets the presentation later today and has a chance to ask any questions he has.
Great, thank you. Anything else, Mr. Steele? Any other comments or questions? Okay, we're done with this subject matter. Thank you very much. Okay, the next agenda item is spending limitation, discussion on function and application of spending limitation. Mr. Wilbur, and I just want to let you know that I know Mr. Evans asked for this, and he's not going to be able, obviously, to make it today, but it's still going to be valuable for everybody else, so thank you very much for being here.
If you just give me a minute to get set up and pass out some material.
Take your time. Who's on the line? Is anybody on the line?
I don't know, I didn't hear from
Given a presentation, I was telling the mayor, given a presentation on transgender, so I think it's my fourth time giving me the task. I'm a trainer now. Although I don't really understand all of it, I'm not getting these questions to go on. I don't know, it's all very clear.
Mr. Wilbur will be right back.
I think you watched the last presentation took off.
Military, so it seemed to matter actually. But I mean, there's definitely like things that commanders have, the regulations commanders have to work through. We'll see if the new administration changes. What the heck is this?
Good night. Yeah, well, Mike just said they're going to send it from my way.
He handed out crayons too.
Did you know what it was? And I didn't look at that. It was about that. Yeah. So he gets it now. But I wanted us to see it before we come. Well, actually, I was just going to you know what I'm saying? That's it. Yeah, so he doesn't have to. But we don't have to. We don't have any chickens. Right. So just. Oh, yeah. Oh, no. There's no going around. And I always look at that, where you ain't never spent. Yeah, I mean, that had to start all over.
This six.
Yeah. But, yeah, things.
So the action.
You guys think it's too obvious to do 3 or 4?
Oh, I did jump.
Okay, so the full year budget, very short, very short.
God bless America.
So the 3 budget reports. So if I'm reading this right, we went over spending limit 3 times in the last 17 years.
I don't know.
We're gonna start. Welcome back, Mr. Wilbur, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so a couple weeks ago at at the Assembly's Budget and Finance Committee meeting, we wanted to have initiate the
Excuse me a
discussion.
minute, can we take the conversation in the corner outside so we can hear Mr. Wilbur, please, gentlemen? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At that meeting, Assemblymember Evans had a desire to make sure that we were making some progress on the review of the spending limit. So I passed out a handout, and then for myself, maybe to the benefit of you, a larger scale of the history that I sent a couple months ago, and then I sent the other day. So what I'd like to do, Madam Chair, is just kind of get this conversation started with the Assembly, and then hopefully give you, as either this body can give the Office of Management and Budget some guidance, but I think what I'd like to do is sort of summarize where OMB sees the process and some of the challenges that we've had. I think Mr. Evans really wanted to spend in some detail. Could you explain the calculation and go through some of that? We'd be happy to do that. I'm not so sure that showing that on the screen in a warm room after lunch would probably be beneficial. We'd all be away very quickly. So what I have is 4 pictures here, just a little bit about the status, some of the elements that we include in the spending limit, and some of the elements that we don't, and then some of the challenges that we have. And on the last page is the current calculation for the 2017 approved budget. And if we get that far, I'll ask Marilyn to kind of step through some of that if you have any particular detail. So I'm going to speak at a pretty high level for today, and then hopefully we can work with the Assembly, the Budget Advisory Commission, and the administration on what is it that you, as Assembly, want to see from that spending limit. What is your goal? What is the outcome that you expect? And so, as you are aware, we passed an ordinance in late November 2016 that basically suspended the requirement for the spending limit for the next 2 years. And not knowing what the Assembly's desires or your goals might be, here's a suggestion. I think if we can develop a calculation that is inclusive, but it also has to be flexible to the things that are outside of our control. There are things that we do control, but there are things that we don't control. And the spending limit does not have the ability to sort of readjust for those things from year to year. And then I think many of you, members of the Budget Advisory Commission, have questions the consistency and how we reviewed it when we put the history together. It's how did you come up with that? And we can talk about that, but the point is that there is sort of the importance of consistency over the year. So, why would we have a spending limit? This is a question for you. This is a question for, and again, for the Budget Advisory Commission. But really, if we do have one, it should be the tool that we use to manage our budget. And then how would we use it? Consider the variables that are in our control. If we're going to modify it, which I would suggest that we at least review, what is it that we should do and what can we not include? And then basically we have to have a tool that allows us to account for how we're growing and how we're maturing. Because a lot of our infrastructure, a lot of our services, they're at that point in their age where just through time, they need a larger attention. While we're still growing and expanding, we also have some infrastructure needs that we have to address as well. So let's just make sure that we consider that when we're building our budget and applying this tool. And then on the bottom here, again, working with the administration, the Budget Advisory Commission, and the Assembly, whether it's through the Budget and Finance Committee or some smaller group of the Assembly, we look for your suggestions on that. So on the second page, if you just turn it over, what you see is a sheet that's really sort of divided in two, and I've made some strong generalities, but the top part in sort of larger letters 1 through 14, these are the elements that we currently include when we do a calculation of the spending limit. And so I'm not going to go through each one of these, but what you suffice it to say is many of these things are similar to what we have in the tax cap, and those that are, for example, population and CPI, the way in which it's calculated is different. And so that makes a big difference on how that calculation is applied. Some considerations that over the years that we've seen when you've seen that history, some of the things that have influenced whether or not the result is under or over the spending limit. Some of these things on the bottom may have influenced those, and some of them have not, but maybe they should. And for example, unrestricted fund balance, the application of fund balance on how we use it. For example, in 2000, in the past, I think it was in 2013, it made a difference whether it was over or under. Because in other years, currently we do not include the expenditures for service areas. It's part of our total spend in our budget. When you look at the total amount, it includes that, but when you calculate the spending limit, it doesn't. And then how do you identify the service area? So that's some discrepancies that we have. If we happen to have an emergency order, if we have a terrible windstorm or some flooding and we've got to apply it, we'll immediately break the spending limit if our budget didn't already include those things. And I think F through H, the CPI, we don't calculate on a 5-year average. We calculate on for CPI, it's July to July, and population, it's just 1 year, not an average. We don't consider new construction. We consider that as part of the tax cap. We consider that part of our growth. Medical CPI, particularly most recently, significantly influenced the costs of our operating budget. It's really something that we don't have control of. So when we set that limit, those things can really skew it very quickly. And the other thing that I want to mention, I have other here, I put it down there. The other thing that we don't include is settlements. When we make a settlement, that settlement cost is not affected in the spending limit when we set it. Now, we could always go reset the spending limit when we have those settlements or those judgments, or maybe we get a new pile of revenue, but we don't do that. And so, as you'll see, we may approve a budget that's within the spending limit, and then we apply unrestricted fund balance, or we do a settlement, or we have an emergency. Any one of those three things can automatically put us over the spending limit. So what do? Do we take services that we've already budgeted and get rid of those so that we can accommodate an emergency? I mean, I don't think that's good government. That's not a good choice. So, but those are all choices that we could make. So I think I've mentioned on the bottom here some of the noted challenges. And right off the bat, what is the purpose of the spending limit? It was created in 1983 prior to the tax cap being voted on and approved. So, what is it that the goal is, the common goal? Some individuals may see it as a limit on our property taxes, and but that's really what the tax cap does. Maybe the spending limit is to limit all spending, irrespective of all of the anomalies that you might get. Is its purpose to sort of limit the just on general government taxes? Is that the spending limit we're focusing on? And if it is, then how do we make accommodations if, for example, we apply for a competitive grant for the state or the feds and we get $2 or $3 million? We can appropriate the grant, but then we'll have to adjust the spending limit to accept it. If that's an action that we want to take, then or not.
Mr. Gilbert has a question, Mr.
Actually, I have several questions, but I think I'll hold off a little bit. But I know Mr. Weldon had a question before me.
No, go ahead. I'll jump in. It could be.
Do you want to wait, or do you want to ask?
Yeah, I'd like back in
Okay,
queue.
great. You're back in the queue. Mr. Weldon, would you like to go now? You want to wait? Okay, thank you. Please
I'm
continue.
almost done, Madam Chair. And again, I'm not going through this quickly on purpose. I just want you to recognize that, we're willing to review it, and we're willing to make some adjustments, but we also need some guidance. We need some sense from the assembly members what it is that you want it to do, what is its actual purpose, and is it going to be different, or does it have to be different than the mechanisms that we already have? I mean, we build the budget based on the tax cap. And so, again, the second bullet here on the third page is what is the relationship of the spending limit to the tax cap, and how do we move those things? There's been some varying scenarios, either in the petition that would be out before the voters. I think Assemblymember Weddleton had a proposal that we might modify the calculations. Any one of those things will get you a different answer, and the interpretation of any one of the elements will get you a different answer. So how we do that and understand that, apply it, and then agree, it could be a very helpful tool. Again, some of the challenges, the fund balance, non-tax revenues, state revenue sharing. Literally, I think in the past, that is what has either made or shown that we either make the spending limit by manipulating the user fees, by showing the user fees, by showing the state revenue sharing as tax money or not. And so that makes a big difference. Classifications and consistency of the variables, the assumptions, that does make a bit of a difference. And then literally the application of how and when we do it. In the past, we've looked at it, we've applied the spending limit calculation in the proposed, in the approved, in the updated, and in the revised. In some years we do that, in some years we haven't. And that's been different. So, and there, as many of you know and members of the BAC are aware, there was a short time in history, and I think Mr. Falsey mentioned this previously, that it wasn't applied, and why we don't know. And frankly, it really doesn't matter. What does matter is what are we going to do moving ahead. So the last page, this is, I'm going to talk at a sort of a high level. This is the current calculation. This is the approved calculation, and I'm going to sort of talk at a higher level, and then I'm going to let Marilyn dig into the details if you have questions. So number one is basically how the 2016 budget was approved. So that is the total budget. Two is taking out everything that's really not tax related, or those are, basically non-tax related. So that, and then we have a new number, which is 307 million. Then we make adjustments for CPI, we use 1 year, and we make adjustments for population, so we get a new bottom line. And then we add back in all of those same things that are not tax related. That gets us a new spending limit. That's where we got to 493. And that's at the number 8. So we start with the tax, we take out the non-tax, we apply a CPI, we get a new number, then we add all the new stuff back in for 17. That gives us a new spending limit. We approve a budget, so the difference between the spending limit and the budget is $10.6 million. You have to recognize we applied about $9 million in fund balance to the 17 budget. That's not any part of this calculation, except in the approved budget. So if we did not apply the fund balance and we weren't going to do the things that were approved in that budget, that's basically the delta. So
Excuse me, Mr. West, in number 1, that last number, 2016, isn't that supposed to be 2017? I just don't want to get confused here. Why
Right.
not?
Marilyn,
Number
do that.
1, left 2017.
No, jump in.
Okay. Speak to.
It says
to the chair.
2016, shouldn't that be 2017?
No.
It's
this
still
year's
2016?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
This year's calculation starts with last year's budget.
Okay, I get it now, thank you. Please continue.
So, I passed out this sheet here. This sheet here has caused a lot of questions. I think Mr. Weddleton sent me 3, but I think the high points in this one here really, I can remember Mr. Weddleton's questions. And we had one question in 2004 about service area creation expansion. Literally, that the number is correct, but we'll need to move that down to, it's basically a PERS calculation. It wasn't a service area, so thank you, Mr. Weddleton, for that one. all of those calculations in 4 through 8, those were all mandated increase related to PERS. They significantly affected how we do our calculation for our spending. But the key pieces are, I think in 2003, 2007 and 8, 10 and 13, those are the years in which we had significant swings in revenue sharing. So if you look at the user fee under 2, letter A, when you look from one year to the next, those numbers are the ones that jump the most. So in one year, the administration said, we're going to take that revenue sharing and we're going to call it property taxes because that's what we're going to do. It's not wrong. It's just not the way it had been done in the past. And we had other years where they counted on it and we didn't get it. So we went over the spending and we didn't adjust. So that's not wrong. That's just the way it was done. So again, I think this sheet tells at a high level, where these changes have been. Through this process, Madam Chair, if we refining this and we get a group of people together, if they want to know how each one of these things got massaged, if you want to go that far into the sausage making, we'll be glad to share it. But I think what we're really looking for is we're looking for something that we can use and something that can be applied consistently if we're going to have a spending. So I know that's debatable among assembly members in the community, so we're looking forward to figuring out which direction you want to go and how we can help.
Thank you, Mr. Bowden. Mr. Dunbar?
Again, ask Mr. Weldon if he wants to go first.
Okay, Mr. Bowden.
I guess maybe it's more of a comment, but on your first page you said you need a calculation that accounts for a growing and maturing city. If we're growing, it hardly matters though, because then spending never grows. We're hitting a time now where population's dropping, inflation's very low, tax cap and the spending cap dropping substantially.
But that could influence it as well.
Growing.
But I think also growing can mean several different things, and that's why maturing is in there, is that our city is changing, we have a maturing population, different services are needed. It's not just the hard population number, there's other factors that go. Our infrastructure is aging out.
Anything else, Mr. Wallace?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
So I have a few questions and comments. I'll try to keep them quick. I guess just going off of what Mr. Weldon said, the medical CPI variance. I mean, we have the highest medical costs, or among the highest medical costs and the highest medical inflation in the whole country. It strikes me that any calculation of CPI or the spending limit that leaves that out is basically nonsensical when it's driving so much of the cost for both the city and the school district. So that's more a comment. Although I would like, and maybe you can point to where, I don't know if there's one place on the sheet where it kind of captures that increase of cost, but if you were able to provide some kind of breakout of here is what medical inflation is doing to us. I know we've got presentations on that subject before.
Okay.
The other thing I'm interested in is B, expenditures by limited road service areas, service areas, not just road service areas. What, and maybe it's on here again, what is that? What is that number? Is that in the several million? Is that in the 10 million? What about how much money is that? So I'm looking at the page which lists all the factors, so I'm curious what B corresponds to, expenditures by limited service area. I just say a comment to say I think C and D should go into any calculation we have. Then my last question is, so it looks like according to this sheet you gave us, this Excel, we busted the spending limit 3 times as a city, according to this, the way it was calculated.
Right.
Once the last year of Wirch, and then two years under Sullivan, 2010 and 2013. And so my question is, and I apologize, I wasn't on this body when that happened. Did Sullivan tell the Assembly he was busting the spending limit? And what was the enforcement mechanism on Sullivan while he was doing that? I mean, is it the court? I mean, what is the enforcement mechanism for the spending limit generally?
So I don't know if Mayor Sullivan knew it. and Mr. Falsey can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that the actual spending limit is a requirement to be included as part of the budget. It's an exercise that we do, but there are elements of it that, and I can confirm that, but, you know, if Mayor Sullivan knew that or not, I don't know. Assemblymember Dunbar. The fact that, you know, in 2013, I think a significant push there had to do with the how the budget was developed with the application of fund balance in that year. And why they did it and what it was for, I have to go back and look.
Mr. Falsey, do you have any comments on that, on enforceability or about Sullivan?
Through the chair, I can only report on the reported comments of the former mayor, who was quoted in the newspaper saying in an email that he didn't recall the city budget office informing him or the assembly that the budgets in any of those years exceeded the spending limit. So he may just not have been aware of the issue. As to the enforcement, that actually becomes something of a tricky question because there is a sort of open question as to whether the assembly's action on a budget that does not expressly address the spending limit can itself implicitly waive the requirements of the spending limit. So the best answer is that the resolution of that question probably awaits on future court.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Just one quick comment. No offense to Mr. Former Mayor Sullivan, but Dick and I were around. No, he didn't tell us, but maybe they didn't even realize it. You know, maybe they weren't even paying attention. I can't say whether they were or not, but I know that we were not. Mr. Weddleton?
You know, like Forrest said, this medical CPI really jumps out. As a former economist in Boston, was part of Anchorage's CPI. We come and look at the game every month to see if we change the price. So my trust in that number is very low. It really documents the true inflation. But, you know, on the CPI variances we saw on that IBEW contract, we're going to limit it to the CPI, I think it was 3.6 or something, CPIU. But we had in Bill's report on the transparency thing, report that the municipalities increase in health care cost was going up at 7 or 8% over the last 5 years or so. Very different. But more than this, we need to figure out, if we're going to break it out, what number we'll really use. And I don't quite understand how we...
Well, and actually, Mr. Weatherton, originally, when we looked at the 2017 budget, the healthcare cost increase projected was 16%, and then the administration went through some various amendments to try and lower it. So it actually, originally, was a much higher age.
And then that is something we have some control over, because in the contract we could say that can't go over X amount, and this is about spending. That's for, is that right? I mean, the healthcare would be for employees. We could say we'll pay X amount per employee, and it will go up more than the CPIU. Then we're
Yeah, so we can't control the increased cost of the healthcare, but the contracts are explicit about the municipality's contribution and the employees' contributions. But so if it limits the municipality's contribution, then the employee's going to pay that cost, and that may or may not affect the spending limit. If the contract says that the employer is going to pay that, that is definitely going to affect our spending. And how much, and will it vary from one year to the next? And it's going faster than the average 5-year CPI by probably 5-fold.
okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Any other comments? I have a comment. Excuse me, David. Anyway, when the spending limit was established many years ago, medical costs were nothing like they are now. So on a personal note, as a assembly member, I think that it is necessary to include the medical CPI and the spending limit calculation. I think we really have to do that. But I also think that we need to continue this discussion at the Budget Finance Committee level and make some decisions and determine what other adjustments need to be made to the spending limit calculation. We have 2 years to do it, but we should kind of start doing it now. Well, we're starting now, and we'll continue the discussion at next month's Budget and Finance Committee meeting. And folks have ideas, please bring them to our next meeting.
Shelley, are you? What role would Budget advisory.
Well, I was just trying to find my notes, and meeting with Marilyn and Lance when we were studying this whole process, Marilyn brought up some good concerns as to if we could have a straight focus on how it should be calculated, a little clearer picture, because when funds come in, like Lance was just saying, that you don't quite know where you want to put it, and it skews the whole thing. So I was trying to find your notes, Marilyn, but you gave me 3 examples of if we could do a path. Like if you could say this and this and this needs to, we're focusing on these. That if you can you clarify that?
I hate to say I don't recall. I'll have to go through my notes. Sure.
Okay, yeah, I forget, I was just looking right now, but it makes sense if we could have a clearer picture on what the objective is. That's our what we would like to see, a clear objective, and we have been advocating that it is used. But I think there are some variables in there, so if it's a clear path, I think it is a good protection, checks and balance.
So if we said, here's what as an assembly we think the goal should be, we dump it on you to do the math, and you go back to the math.
Sure. I mean, it could vary when we can have a clear, objective.
Thank you, Mr. Overton. Mr. Dunbar?
I think, I just want to say really quickly, I appreciate the work you guys are doing on this, Lance, and I think if we do go forward with new spending limit, I want to echo what Ms. Gray Jackson was saying, that it has to be, it has to take the world as it actually is. And the world as it actually is, our healthcare inflation is dramatically higher than our regular CPI. So I don't see myself supporting any kind of spending limit that doesn't take into account healthcare inflation. And so I kind of just want to hammer that home again. I also think that B, C, and D here all make a lot of sense to me. That we should include limited service areas that we're going to be spending, that we need to have some kind of emergency capability, and then finally, we shouldn't be artificially limiting our own ability to go after federal, state, and private grants. I mean, I think that's kind of a no-brainer. So anyway, thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Do you have any other questions, audience participation?
Yeah, sure. So as far as enforceability goes, I mean, the spending limit's an ordinance and the tax cap's in charter. So if it's an ordinance, the assembly accepts ordinance by passing a budget, right? So that would just override the spending limit ordinance. Is that how that works?
So the ordinance that we have right now is suspending the use of this, the application of the spending.
Oh yeah, but I just mean by passing a budget, doesn't the assembly, that's setting a new law essentially, that's setting new ordinance.
Well, the spending limit is in the code, okay, but right now, so it's a law, it's in the code.
Yeah.
But right now, it's suspended for 2 years.
No, but, I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
I think your question is, when you pass the budget and you were over the spending limit, essentially that is
breaking the law,
overriding, overriding the spending limit for that year.
Right. So I think that this is exactly what Mr. Falsey said, and it has not yet gone to court.
Yeah.
But because it's in code, not charter, I think your interpretation is basically correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And I just want to make a comment. The code is the law. Okay. But anyway, that's all I want to say. Any other audience participation? Okay. Thank you, everybody.